At first glance, The Long Dark and Don't Starve are two very different kinds of survival games. One attempts to offer an authentic and unforgiving survival experience, while the other is more focused on being a video game first and foremost. One takes place from a grounded first-person perspective, the other is in third person and features a much more playful art style. The two developers, Hinterland and Clay, clearly had very different priorities and intentions while designing each game, and yet what might surprise you is how similar they are in one particular way. Both games turn time into a resource. Not only does the player's survival depend on how well they can scavenge for food and other supplies, but it's also determined by how effectively they use the hours in each day. The player is required to be thoughtful about how they spend their time and what activities they should prioritize in order to survive. Something that I think sets both games apart from many of their contemporaries in the genre. In this video, I'll be comparing how The Long Dark and Don't Starve achieve this in both similar and different ways. In order for time to be valuable, and therefore worth managing in the first place, a number of factors need to be in place. First off, time needs to be limited in some way. The Long Dark accomplishes this mostly through its day and night cycle, which is split between 13 in-game hours of light and 11 in-game hours of darkness. Each night brings with it a number of changes that severely limit how productive the player can be. When the sun goes down, so does the temperature, meaning you freeze to death far more quickly and need to stay indoors longer to keep warm. Exploration also becomes more of a challenge, not only due to a lack of visibility, but because generating light uses up precious resources, whether it be fuel for a lantern or wood and cloth for a torch. On top of all that, wolves become more alert and aggressive after sundown. Overall, these mechanics work together to make every night harsh, and to restrict the player's ability to collect food and other crucial supplies, which in turn makes every hour of daylight matter. By comparison, Don't Starve takes a more rigid approach to limiting your time. The game also has a day and night cycle, but it's a lot more restrictive than in The Long Dark. Here, the darkness of night doesn't just make it harder to explore or perform certain actions, but it will literally kill you if you stay in it for too long, forcing the player to keep a light source with them at all times, usually that of a nearby campfire. So once again, exploration is more difficult and resource intensive than it is when the sun is out, which makes daytime valuable and something that shouldn't go to waste. The clockwork nature of these cycles places an immediate restriction on your time, but where Don't Starve differs from The Long Dark is in the addition of seasons. Unlike the perpetual winter of The Long Dark, the world of Don't Starve is constantly shifting from summer to winter and back to summer again. The Reign of Giants DLC throws spring and autumn into the mix too, for a grand total of 4 seasons, each with their own weather conditions and changes that they bring to the world. This acts as an additional layer of limitation because certain activities only occur at specific times of the year. For example, bees don't leave their hives during the winter and therefore stop producing honey, thus cutting off a valuable source of food for the player. On the other hand, some important items can only be obtained from creatures that spawn during particular seasons. That brings us to the second factor in how both games encourage you to be careful with your time, by having high stakes that punish you for not using your time effectively. In both The Long Dark and Don't Starve, death is permanent in most cases, and succumbing to its sweet embrace means losing everything and starting over with a new character. So any mistake the player makes, whether it be due to complacency or carelessness, could potentially lead to their demise. And more often than not, deaths in both games happen due to lack of preparation, which, of course, you're given a limited amount of time to do. In the case of Don't Starve, the most obvious example of this is winter, which by default begins on day 21 after the start of a new world. When I played Don't Starve for the first time, I celebrated making it to my first winter, and then promptly starved to death when my farm stopped yielding food because of the cold temperature. It took me several more attempts to learn how to brace against the harshness of this season, and how to get the most out of what limited time I was given to prepare for it. Crops and other important resources stop growing, bees stop producing honey, and fishing ponds freeze over, meaning I needed to stockpile enough food and materials to last me until summer. The threat of hypothermia meant I needed to craft warm clothing and other items to prevent myself from freezing to death, and the shorter days caused my sanity to drain more rapidly. All of these dangers required me to carefully manage what limited time I had in the summer in order to prepare for them, as any one of them could potentially be my downfall. The 2 seasons added by the Reign of Giants DLC also introduced their own unique changes and hazards, such as the scorching heat of summer or the torrential downpour of spring. All this, plus I haven't even mentioned the hounds that hunt down the player at regular intervals, which is yet another periodic danger the player needs to stay vigilant of. Going back to the Long Dark, the consequences of not managing your time are much more subtle and gradual than they are in Don't Starve. It's always winter in the desolate Canadian wilderness the game is set in, and outside the game's story and challenge modes, there's no obvious event the player needs to ready themselves for. Instead, the challenge comes from being prepared for the inevitable depletion of non-renewable resources. At the start of a new game, players can usually get by off of whatever supplies they scavenge from abandoned houses or elsewhere in the world. This is especially true in the coastal highway and mountain town regions, which feature many buildings stocked with food and resources for starting fires. But as time marches on, survival gradually becomes more and more difficult, as the canned soup and granola bars begin to run out and the player is faced with starvation. The only renewable food source available is the local wildlife population, which the player will eventually need to hunt or fish for in order to stay alive, which once again takes a lot of time and preparation. For instance, the player can hunt down wild deer for their meat, but they need a ranged weapon in order to do so. The most sustainable option is to craft a bow and arrows, which takes a long time because the materials used to make one need to be cured indoors for several days before they become usable. So if you wait too long to make one, there's a good chance you'll starve to death before you can even finish it, because you didn't make effective use of what little time you had. So while Don't Starve is cyclical in the way the player must always be bracing themselves for whatever the next season will bring, The Long Dark is more like a constant uphill slope, where survival is forgiving at first but steadily becomes tougher the longer you're alive, as the player is required to live off the land and invest their time wisely in order to develop the means to do so. The final piece of what makes time management interesting in both games is how each of these factors, limited time and high stakes for wasting it, drive player choice, and create tangible consequences for those choices. In this regard, the biggest way The Long Dark differs from Don't Starve is that many important actions take a significant amount of time to complete. Breaking down furniture for raw materials, reading skill books to increase your stats, gutting an animal, cooking various foods, repairing clothes, and creating a map of an area can all take hours of in-game time to complete. Even actions that don't take long to do, such as collecting water, starting fires, or even just eating food, all take a small amount of time that can quickly add up over the course of a day. The player has to be mindful about which activities they choose to prioritize because, much like in the real world, everything you do takes up precious time. Additionally, certain actions can put the player in potential danger while doing them, such as surveying an area or harvesting meat from a corpse, which temporarily leaves the player vulnerable both to predators and to hypothermia. This adds an additional risk-reward dynamic to the gameplay, with the player constantly weighing the pros and cons of completing certain tasks that put them in harm's way. Contrast this with Don't Starve, where most actions take only a second or two to complete, and even longer tasks such as growing crops or drying meat usually takes no more than a couple days, versus the weeks it can take to cure pelts and hides in The Long Dark. Here, where it could take hours to cook a fish or harvest a resource, in Don't Starve you can do it pretty much instantaneously. The game compensates for this by having a much shorter day and night cycle, lasting only 8 minutes a pop, and by having tighter deadlines by which to prepare for the various seasons, usually 20 days at the most. The player is also given a lot more options for dealing with these seasons, both in terms of available food sources and items they can craft. So in The Long Dark, choice comes more from how the player decides to divide their time between a small number of activities that are all very time-consuming, versus Don't Starve, where the player has to juggle many different tasks and decide which ones are most suitable to their playstyle and offer them the best chance of survival. All these differences may seem like minor observations when viewed on their own, but together they have a significant impact on how each game feels to play, and reflect the intentions of their respective developers. For this reason, I think judging each system out of context to determine which one is quote-unquote better would be missing the point, because their success is ultimately dependent on the focus of their respective games. The time mechanics in The Long Dark work because they complement the patient, slow-burning survival experience the game sets out to be, while Don't Starve's implementation affirms its focus as a game centered around more traditional mechanics and systems. Having said that, I do think the way The Long Dark handles time is a bit more interesting than in Don't Starve because of its subtlety. Most games that treat time as a resource put these mechanics front and center for the player to see, such as the 3-day cycle of Majora's Mask or the 60-second lives used in Minute. So it's compelling to see a game like The Long Dark take a more understated approach to making you manage your time, and it stands as another example of how many ideas remain to be explored when it comes to using time as a game mechanic. As for what exactly those ideas might be, I guess only time will tell. Thanks for watching.